The wheelchair was empty. Overturned in the gutter outside Pine Hollow Police Department, rain hammering the plastic frame, one wheel still spinning. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked. Until a German shepherd planted all four paws on the wet sidewalk and refused to move. 12 years old, cerebral palsy. Nearly 2 miles through a November storm, alone, because her mother had been missing for 3 days and no one was listening. What Ava Bennett pulled from beneath her soaked jacket would blow open a financial conspiracy that had been bleeding this quiet Oregon town dry for years, and the only ones who believed her were a broken veteran and his dog. If stories like this hit different for you, subscribe. Drop your city in the comments. Let me see how far this one travels. The rain started before dawn and hadn't let up. By 7:15 in the morning, Pine Hollow looked the way it always looked in November. Gray, wet, gutters running brown with pine needles and dead leaves. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself but just settled into your bones while you were busy thinking about something else. The mountains were invisible behind cloud. The one traffic light on Carver Street blinked yellow because nobody had bothered to program it for weekday mornings since the county cut the maintenance budget 2 years ago. Ethan Calloway was not a morning person and had stopped pretending otherwise around the time he left the Navy. He ran because his physical therapist told him he had to, not because he wanted to. He let Ranger set the pace now, which meant slower than it used to be. The dog was 8, which was old for a working shepherd, and his right hip had started showing it. They moved along the river trail at the edge of town, past the closed bait shop, past the footbridge that needed new planks, past the bench where the high school kids left cigarette butts they thought nobody noticed. Ranger had a particular way of moving when something bothered him. Not aggressive, more like the way a compass needle drifts. A slight pull in one direction. His ears would shift, and his stride would change from a comfortable trot to something more deliberate, more loaded, like a man who spotted something in a crowd and hasn't decided yet what to do about it. He did it now, coming up the slope from the river trail toward Carver Street. Ethan felt the leash go tight. Easy. Ranger wasn't listening. He pulled left toward the front of the police station, which sat on the corner of Carver and 3rd in a building that had once been a hardware store. There was a concrete ramp at the edge of the parking lot, a single streetlight overhead, and a handicapped access curb cut that had been installed crooked and never fixed. It was at the bottom of that curb cut where Ethan saw the wheelchair, on its side. One wheel still rotating slowly in the rain. He didn't process the rest of it immediately. The mind sometimes delays things it isn't ready for. He saw the chair first, then the backpack spilled open on the wet asphalt, the papers soaking through, then the girl lying on her side next to it, one arm extended, cheek against the pavement. She wasn't unconscious. Her eyes were open. She was looking directly at him. "Please," she said. It barely came out above the rain. Ethan was already moving. Ranger moved with him, no command needed, staying low and calm the way he'd been trained to approach unknown situations. Not crowding, not retreating, just present. Hey, I see you." Ethan knelt beside her, one hand going to her shoulder. "Don't try to get up. Can you tell me where you're hurt?" "I'm not hurt." Her voice was thin but focused. "The curb. My chair hit the curb." He assessed fast. No visible blood, no obvious fractures. The way she moved her fingers told him she had sensation. She had cerebral palsy. He could see it in the tone of her limbs, the slight asymmetry in how she held herself. She'd gone down hard on wet pavement, but hadn't hit her head. Lucky. More lucky than she probably knew. Okay, I'm going to help you up. Tell me your name." "Ava." "Ethan, this is Ranger." The dog had settled beside her head, not touching her, just there. "He's friendly. Can I move you?" "Yes, please, I have to talk to someone inside." He got her up carefully, checked the wheelchair for damage. The left armrest had cracked, but the frame was intact, and helped her back into it. She was shaking, and not entirely from cold. Her jacket was soaked through. Her hair was plastered to her face. She had been crying at some point, though she wasn't crying now. The expression she wore instead was something that took Ethan a moment to name: determination. The specific, quiet, slightly desperate kind that comes after someone has already given up on expecting help and decided to manage without it. He'd seen it in the field, usually on operators who'd already burned through their last option. He didn't expect to see it on a 12-year-old's face outside a small-town Oregon police station. "How did you get here?" he asked. "I wheeled." "From where?" "Home." She paused. Maple Creek Road. Ethan knew Maple Creek Road. It was nearly 2 miles away, on the far side of a stretch with no sidewalk and a highway crossing that had no pedestrian signal. In the rain. In November. He looked at her for a moment. Then he held the station door open. "Come on, let's get you inside." Oh. The officer at the front desk, a young guy named Briggs, maybe 26, the kind of fresh that hadn't been weathered yet, looked up from his monitor when Ethan pushed through the door with Ava beside him and Ranger at heel. "Sir, the dog can't—" "Service animal designation," Ethan said. "Ranger's a certified working dog." It was technically true, though the certification was military rather than civilian. He said it with enough flatness that Briggs decided not to press it. Ethan got Ava a chair in the waiting area. She refused to leave her wheelchair, so she sat beside it instead. And someone produced a blanket and a cup of hot water with a tea bag, because that was apparently all they had. Ranger settled on the floor beside her without being asked. Ava was 12, and her name was Ava Bennett, and her mother had been missing for 3 days. Ethan learned this in pieces, the way you learn things from someone who's been holding them together alone for too long and isn't entirely sure yet whether it's safe to let go. She spoke carefully, like she'd rehearsed it. Her mother was Rachel Bennett, 34 years old, accountant. She worked for something called the Willow Ridge Agricultural Cooperative, which Ethan vaguely knew as the operation out on Route 9 that supplied feed and equipment to the farms in the county. Rachel had left for work on Thursday morning. That was 3 days ago. She hadn't come home Thursday night, which was unusual but not impossible. Sometimes she worked late, sometimes she stopped at her sister's. But Ava had called. No answer, straight to voicemail. She'd tried again Friday morning, same result. She'd called the cooperative's office number and been told that Rachel had left for the day. She'd called her aunt, who lived 40 minutes away and hadn't heard from Rachel either. She'd called the police on Friday afternoon. She'd been told that an adult missing for 24 hours was not yet a formal case, that there were many reasons an adult might not answer their phone, and that she should contact family members and wait to see if Rachel came home. Ava had waited. Rachel hadn't come home. She'd called again Saturday morning and been told someone would follow up. Nobody had followed up. By Sunday morning, Ava had eaten the last of what was in the refrigerator. Her wheelchair battery was at 11%. Her mother always charged it overnight. It was part of their routine without exception. And she had made a decision. If no one was coming to her, she would go to them. Briggs, to his credit, was taking notes. But Ethan could read the frequency he was operating on. The patient, slightly detached register of someone performing the motions of taking a report while internally categorizing it under domestic situation, low priority, adult made a choice. It was the way Ava said the thing about the wheelchair battery that changed the temperature of the room. "My mom would never leave without charging my chair." She said it plainly, not dramatically, like she was stating a fact about physics. It doesn't matter what happened or where she went, she would have charged it first, always. Even if she was angry at me, which she wasn't, even if it was an emergency. It's the last thing she does before she sleeps. Briggs stopped typing. An older officer named Demko, who'd been standing near the hallway entrance with a coffee cup, turned around. Ethan was watching Ava, and he understood exactly what she was saying. He'd built enough operational profiles in his career to know that people are creatures of habit, even under pressure, maybe especially under pressure. A mother with a disabled child doesn't break that particular routine unless something breaks it for her. It's not a character trait. It's a structural behavior, load-bearing, the kind you don't abandon casually. She wasn't offering it as evidence. She was stating it as truth, the way only someone who has lived inside that routine for years can state it. Demko set his coffee down. "Who's been with you?" he asked Ava. "These 3 days?" "No one." Another pause. "Neighbors?" "I didn't want to scare anyone." She looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I thought she'd come back." Ethan didn't say anything. He was looking at Ava's lap, where she was holding something beneath the blanket, something she'd been keeping tucked against her side since they'd come in from the rain. He'd noticed it outside when he'd helped her up. She'd held it with her arm even while she was down on the pavement, hadn't let it touch the ground. "What's that?" he asked quietly, just for her. She looked at him. Then she looked at Demko. Then she made some kind of calculation behind her eyes that he wasn't entirely privy to. She brought it out. It was a small notebook, spiral-bound. The cover was dark blue and warped from the damp, but Ava had kept it pressed against her body so the pages were mostly intact. Rachel's handwriting covered the first dozen or so, tight, careful script with the particular compression of someone who'd learned to write fast during long meetings. "I found it in her desk drawer on Friday," Ava said. "She never leaves her work notebook at home. She takes it with her every day." Demko reached for it carefully. He looked at the first pages, then the next. His expression didn't shift much, but Ethan saw the specific stillness that comes over a person when they're reading something that requires them to recalibrate. Ethan leaned slightly. He could see enough. Column of numbers, dates, invoice references. And then, written in a circle in the margin, as if Rachel had come back to it multiple times. North Valley Storage, 4 entries, no delivery confirmation. And beneath that, underlined once, "Who's signing these?" Demko looked up at Briggs. Something passed between them. "I'm going to need to make a call," Demko said. Ava pulled the blanket tighter and looked at Ethan. He hadn't planned on staying. He had a physical therapy appointment at 10 that he'd already rescheduled twice, a truck that needed an oil change, and a general policy of not getting involved in things that weren't his to be involved in. A policy he'd developed after the Navy. After a period of his life he didn't talk about much. After he'd learned the hard way that not every problem is yours to solve, and that jumping into situations without a role can make things worse. He looked at Ranger. Ranger had his chin resting on the edge of Ava's wheelchair armrest. Not the one she was sitting in, the broken one, on its side beside her. He'd placed it there deliberately, the way he always did when he'd decided something. Ethan sat back down. "Tell me about your mom," he said to Ava. "What's she like?" It was the right question, and he knew it was the right question because of the way her face changed. Not breaking open exactly, but shifting, some of the rigid control going out of it. "She's really organized," Ava said. "She has a system for everything. She color codes the calendar. She knows every single invoice that goes through her office by memory." She paused. "She was scared of something the last couple weeks. She didn't say so, but I could tell. She'd close her laptop really fast when I came in the room." "Did she say anything about work? About anything unusual?" Ava was quiet for a moment. "She said the numbers weren't matching what was actually reaching the farms. That's what she said. The numbers don't match what's reaching the farms." I didn't understand what that meant. "I was watching TV." She looked at the blanket. "I should have asked her." Ethan kept his voice level. "You were watching TV. That's what you were supposed to be doing." She needed someone to talk to. She had someone to talk to. She just needed to figure out who. Across the room, Demko was on the phone, speaking low and fast. Briggs had pulled Rachel's name up on his terminal and was reading something with a new quality of attention. The station had the particular atmosphere of a space in which the temperature of a situation has quietly changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced, but everyone slightly more awake. Outside, the rain was easing, not stopping, just easing, the way November rain did out here, pulling back not because it was finished, but because it was taking stock. Ava's hands rested on her lap. She was looking at the front door, at the pale gray light coming through the glass. "She's alive," she said. Not to Ethan specifically. More like she was stating a position, setting a parameter. "This is what I have decided to be true, and I am not entertaining the alternative." Ethan had known soldiers who operated that way. It was a particular kind of dangerous hope, the kind that could break you if you were wrong, but that also kept you functional when nothing else could. He didn't tell her she might be wrong. He said, "We're going to find her." Demko crossed the room. He had the focused, forward-leaning quality of a man who'd just been told something that upgraded the situation. "We're requesting a formal search," he said, "and we need to look at this notebook with the county sheriff's financial crimes liaison." He looked at Ethan. "You said the dog has tracking experience?" 8 years, air scent and ground track certified." Demko looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at him with the steady, unhurried attention of an animal that has worked alongside humans long enough to know when it's being evaluated and has absolutely no interest in performing for the evaluation. "We could use him," Demko said. Ethan looked at Ava. She was already looking at him. "Go," she said. "Find her." He stood. Ranger was already on his feet. Ethan was halfway to the door when Demko's radio crackled. The desk unit, not his handheld, loud enough that everyone in the room heard it. Unit 4, come back. We've got a vehicle match on the Bennett plate. Location, you're not going to believe this, Old Willow Ridge Equipment Barn on Depot Road. It's inside the property fence. The room went completely still. Ethan turned around slowly. Ava's knuckles had gone white on the armrests of her chair. The Willow Ridge Equipment Barn. The same cooperative that employed Rachel Bennett. The same cooperative whose invoice numbers filled the notebook Ava had carried 2 miles through the rain to protect. Rachel's car had been there the whole time. Demko was already moving toward the desk unit when Ethan caught the address. Depot Road, north edge of town, past the grain elevator. He knew the stretch. Knew it well enough to know there was nothing out there that would explain why a woman's car would be parked inside a locked agricultural property on a Sunday morning after 3 days of silence. Nobody had looked there. That was the thing sitting in the middle of the room that nobody was saying out loud yet. 3 days. 2 calls from a 12-year-old girl reporting her mother missing. And nobody had looked at the woman's place of employment. Demko grabbed his jacket. Briggs was already on his radio requesting backup and a supervisor notification. The station, which 20 minutes ago had the low-energy hum of a Sunday morning skeleton crew, had shifted into something faster, something with forward momentum. Ethan looked back at Ava. She was watching him with the particular stillness of a child who has learned to read rooms the way other people read weather, by small signs, by shifts in pressure, by what people choose not to say. "Is that where she is?" Ava asked. "We don't know yet. But her car is there," Ethan said. "That's what we know right now. That's a good thing, Ava. That's more than we knew 10 minutes ago." She absorbed that. Her jaw was tight. "I want to come." "You can't." "I know the cooperative. My mom talked about it. I know some of..." "Ava." He said it quiet and straight, not harsh. "I need you here. If we find something and we need information fast, you're the only person who knows your mother well enough to fill in the gaps. Demko's going to leave someone with you. You stay here, you stay warm, and you stay ready. Okay?" She didn't like it. She didn't pretend to like it. But she looked at Ranger, who was still standing, leash loose, watching Ethan. And something in her expression recalibrated. "Take him," she said. "He'll find her." Ethan clipped the leash short and followed Demko out into the rain. The drive to Depot Road took 9 minutes. Ethan rode in the back of Demko's cruiser with Ranger between his knees, one hand on the dog's back, feeling the vibration of contained attention in the animal's frame. Ranger worked best when Ethan was calm. That had been true since the beginning, since the first deployment, since the first time they'd gone into a structure together, and Ethan had learned that everything he was feeling was broadcasting itself down the leash in real time. The dog was a biofeedback loop. You couldn't fake it with him. He breathed slowly and watched the town slide past the rain-streaked window. Pine Hollow was the kind of place that looked better from a distance than up close. From the highway approach, you got mountains and timber and the silver thread of the Hollow River and a cluster of buildings that suggested a postcard. Up close, you got the hardware store that had closed, the diner that was on its 3rd different owner in 6 years, the residential streets where every other house had a truck in the yard that hadn't moved in a while. Agricultural country that had been squeezing tighter for a decade, the margins on farming getting thinner every year, families that had worked the same land for 3 generations now, trying to figure out the math on staying. The cooperative was supposed to be part of what made staying possible. Feed pricing, equipment access, bulk purchasing that individual farms couldn't manage alone. Ethan didn't know much about its internal structure, but he knew enough about how those operations worked to understand that an accountant who noticed something wrong in the invoices was in a particular kind of position. The kind where the information you hold is dangerous, not because it's complicated, but because it's simple. Numbers that don't add up, deliveries that don't arrive. Money going somewhere it shouldn't. Simple enough that when someone wanted it to disappear, the easiest thing to make disappear was the person who found it. He didn't say this to Demko. It was speculative. But it was sitting in the back of his mind with the particular weight of things that have passed from theory into something more operational. The barn came up on the left, a long metal structure behind a chain-link fence, partially obscured by a row of Douglas firs that had grown up against the property line. The gate was padlocked, or had been. Ethan could see from the cruiser that the chain was hanging loose, the padlock open, which either meant someone had a key or someone had been here recently enough that they hadn't bothered to resecure it. Rachel's car was a gray Honda Civic, parked close to the barn's side wall, partially hidden by the angle of the trees. If you weren't looking for it, if you were driving past on Depot Road and not specifically scanning the property, you'd miss it. Someone had known that. Someone had put it there knowing that. 2 more units pulled in behind Demko, 4 officers total, plus Ethan and Ranger. Not a full tactical response, but enough. Demko coordinated it with the efficient, low-drama competence of someone who'd been doing this long enough to not perform urgency. Calloway, you and the dog do a perimeter read first. Don't enter the structure until I've got eyes on the approach from the other side. You stay with my people, not ahead of them. Understood. I mean it. You're a civilian volunteer. You go where I say, when I say. I heard you the first time. Demko looked at him for a half second, reassessing something. Then he nodded and moved. Ethan unclipped the leash to let Ranger work on a long line, 30 feet, enough room to cast properly without losing contact. He'd brought the scent article from the station, one of Rachel's gloves that Ava had kept in her backpack. He presented it to Ranger at nose level, held it while the dog worked it, watched the shift happen. The moment the dog locked the scent into working memory and went from companion mode into something older and more precise, Ranger's nose dropped. His tail came up. He moved. Not toward the car. That was interesting. The car was downwind, which should have been the stronger pull if Rachel had simply been sitting in it recently. But Ranger angled left toward the barn's near corner, tracking something that the rain hadn't washed out, which meant either the scent was strong enough or recent enough or both. Ethan followed. One of Demko's officers, a woman named Fitch, who'd introduced herself with a handshake and approximately 0 small talk, moved parallel on his left, hand at her holster, but not on it. The other units were going around the back. The barn doors on the near side were secured with a padlock that was definitely still locked. The side door, a smaller access panel 10 feet further along, was not. It was closed, but the latch was broken. Not recently broken. The wood around it was weathered and splintered in a way that suggested it had been like this for a while. The kind of maintenance deferred indefinitely because the barn was classified as inactive and nobody was prioritizing it. Ranger stopped at the side door. His entire body went still in that particular way. Weight forward, nose working in short, rapid pulls. The behavioral signature Ethan had learned to read as here, this, inside. He looked at Fitch. She called it in on her radio, waited for Demko's voice to come back. Hold position, 30 seconds. They held. The rain came down on the metal roof overhead with a sound like white noise, steady and all-encompassing, the kind of ambient noise that swallowed smaller sounds and made the silence underneath feel pressurized. Demko came around the far corner with one of the other officers. Okay, he said. We go in together. Calloway, your dog stays on leash until I clear the structure. He's not going to on leash. Ethan clipped him back to a 6-foot lead without arguing. Demko wasn't wrong, and the time for arguing about protocol wasn't standing outside a potentially active scene. Demko went in first. Fitch went second. Ethan and Ranger third, the remaining officer pulling the door wide and holding it. Inside, the barn smelled like old machine oil, rust, and damp concrete. The space was large, maybe 120 feet long, 30 wide, with a high metal ceiling and 2 rows of defunct equipment, an old combine that hadn't moved in years, a row of empty feed bins stacked 3 high along the far wall, miscellaneous hardware hanging from pegboards that had gone orange with surface rust. 3 skylights, all filmed with grime and streaked with rain, let in a flat and colorless light that made everything look like it was underwater. Nobody was there. No movement. No sound under the rain. Ranger pulled left. Ethan followed the pull, letting him work, and Ranger took them directly to the far wall where the empty feed bins were stacked. He sat. That was the alert. A clean, deliberate sit, nose pointed at the gap between the bins and the wall. Here, Ethan said. Demko came over. He and Fitch moved 2 of the bins, heavy plastic, awkward, screeching against the concrete, and behind them, in the narrow corridor between the stack and the wall, they found Rachel Bennett's handbag. And her phone. The phone's screen was shattered, not cracked, shattered, the kind of damage that comes from being dropped hard on a solid surface, or thrown. The bag had been pushed back deliberately, not dropped. It was too far in, too precisely positioned to have landed there by accident. Demko crouched and looked without touching. "Crime scene protocol," he said to Fitch. "Call it in." Ethan stood back and watched Ranger, who was still sitting, still oriented at the wall, but whose nose had shifted slightly, not toward the bag, which he'd already indicated, but upward and to the right. Scent pooling differently, layering. Rachel had been here. She'd been here recently enough that Ranger was still working a warm trail. But she wasn't here now, which meant she'd left, or been moved. Demko was photographing the scene with his phone while Fitch called in the evidence report. The second officer had gone back to the exterior to establish a perimeter. For a moment it was just Ethan and Ranger in the dimness, and Ethan let the dog move, not commanding, just observing, and Ranger cast in a slow arc toward the barn's back wall. There was a second exit, a standard personnel door different from the main equipment doors, set into the back wall near the far corner. Ethan had noted it on entry. Ranger went to it, paused, came back, went to it again. Ethan called over his shoulder, "Demko, he's got something at the back door." Demko came without rushing but without wasting time. He examined the back door. The latch here was functional, the padlock that should have been on it gone. The hasp simply closed. He pushed it open with the back of his hand and they were looking at a cracked concrete apron and then a muddy service road, heavily rutted, disappearing into the trees in the direction of the low ground behind the property. Ranger's nose went up. Air scent now, working higher, reading the atmospheric layer. "She went that way," Ethan said, "or was taken that way. Trail's still warm. He wouldn't alert this strong on a 3-day-old scent, not in this rain." Ethan looked at the mud. "And look at the ruts. Recent. Something drove back there." Demko looked at the ruts and then at Ethan and then at Ranger. "How recent?" "Last 12, maybe 24 hours. Rain's been steady, but these are still defined. Edges haven't washed out yet." Demko was quiet for a moment. The radio on his shoulder crackled with background traffic from the other units. He was making calculations. Resources, liability, scope. The difference between a missing person's welfare check and something that was starting to look like a crime scene that had been deliberately constructed to be missed. "We need the sheriff's office in on this," he said finally, "and I need to make another call." He stepped back inside. Ethan stayed in the doorway, looking at the service road. Ranger sat beside him, leash slack, still air-scenting with that particular focused patience that wasn't patience at all, but rather sustained attention maintained at a level most humans couldn't hold for 30 seconds. Fitch appeared beside Ethan. "You were Navy?" she said. Not hostile. More like someone pulling together a file. "Yeah." "SEAL?" "Yeah." "The dog was military?" 8 years, 3 deployments. Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. He paused. "He's good at this." Fitch looked at Ranger for a moment. "I can see that." They stood in silence and listened to the rain on the metal roof. "She's alive," Ethan said. He wasn't sure why he said it. He wasn't the type to make declarations without data. But something in the scene, the bag pushed back deliberately, the trail still warm, the fact that someone had bothered to move the car to a position that concealed it, rather than simply abandoning it, all of it suggested an effort to buy time rather than an irreversible event. You buy time when you need it. You need it when something is still in motion. Fitch didn't answer, but she didn't contradict him either. 45 minutes later, a blue SUV with county sheriff's markings pulled through the gate, followed by a white sedan that had no markings at all. From the sedan came a man named Hargrove, mid-50s, civilian clothes, the compact and slightly remote quality of someone who worked financial crimes and had learned to move through active scenes without disturbing them because his evidence was never physical until you made it so. Demko briefed him at the barn entrance. Ethan stood to the side and listened because nobody told him not to. Hargrove took the notebook, bagged now, photographed in situ, and stood reading it for a long time. Not every page. He seemed to know which pages mattered. He went to the invoice section and stayed there. "North Valley Storage," he said. "That mean something?" Demko asked. "It means something if the cooperative has been billing delivery fees to North Valley Storage for the past 18 months, and North Valley Storage has never received a delivery." He kept his eyes on the notebook. It means something if that storage facility's listed owner is a shell company with a registered address in Portland that nobody's ever occupied. He looked up. It means something. How much are we talking? Hard to say without the full records. But invoices don't lie about volume, and the volume in these notes is, he paused, significant. These are farm supply accounts, feed, equipment parts, fuel supplements. If you're billing delivery on goods that aren't actually delivered and skimming the margin over 18 months across a full county cooperative, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Rachel Bennett found this, Demko said. Apparently. She's been missing 3 days. I see that. The two men looked at each other. Ethan spoke from his position against the wall. Someone knew she was looking. They needed her out of the picture long enough to either destroy the records or create enough distance between themselves and the scheme to make prosecution difficult. He kept his voice neutral. They took her somewhere. Not here. She passed through here, recently, within the last day. The trail goes out the back. Hargrove looked at him for the first time. And you are? Volunteer. The dog is mine. Hargrove looked at Ranger, then back at Ethan. Some kind of assessment happened behind his eyes that Ethan was used to. The moment when someone reads the sum of what's in front of them and decides how much weight to give it. Where does the trail go? Hargrove asked. Service road heading northeast, into the low ground behind the property. I'd need to follow it to know more. How long would that take? Depends on where she is. Hargrove turned back to Demko. Expand the search radius. I need access to the cooperative's financial records before anyone inside that organization knows we're looking. He was already pulling out his phone. And someone needs to talk to the people who run that place. Carefully. Without alerting anyone about the scope of what we've found. He walked away toward the far end of the barn, phone at his ear. Demko exhaled. It wasn't a sigh. More like the sound a man makes when the situation has grown past the shape he originally assigned it, and he's adjusting. Your dog, he said to Ethan. Can he follow that service road trail? That's what he does. Then let's go. The service road was barely a road, 2 ruts in a strip of ground that had been driven enough times to suppress the grass, but not enough to establish anything structural. It wound northeast through a stand of second-growth fire, sloping gently downward toward the low floodplain ground, where the soil turned dark and soft and held the rain in shallow pools that reflected the gray sky. Ranger worked ahead on a 30-foot line, nose alternating between ground and air, his stride covering ground with the efficient, ground-eating trot that Ethan recognized as confidence. When a dog is unsure of a trail, they cast, wide sweeping arcs, back and forth, working the edges. When they're sure, they move like Ranger was moving now, direct, with occasional pauses to verify at points where the scent pool had thinned over a patch of gravel or compressed turf. Demko and Fitch moved with them. The other officers had stayed at the barn to process the scene with Hargrove. Nobody talked much. The terrain required attention, the ground was slippery, the visibility in the trees limited, and there were places where the service road forked or seemed to fork, and Ranger had to work the alternatives before committing. 20 minutes in, the trees thinned. The service road emerged onto a wider gravel track that connected back to a paved county road running east. There was a wide spot in the gravel where vehicles had turned around. Ranger worked it in careful circles. The scent was still here, strong enough that he vocalized slightly, a low sound deep in his throat that Ethan had never quite heard him make in civilian work, only in the field. The trail continued east along the county road. On foot, that was a long way. By vehicle, it was nothing. Ethan looked at Demko. She was moved by vehicle, he said. Trails continuous from the barn. Someone drove her out. Demko was on his radio. He gave coordinates, described the intersection, requested a map overlay of structures within a 2-mile radius in the northeast direction. Fitch was scanning the gravel. She crouched near the turnaround. Tire impressions, she said. 2 sets, one going in, one going out. The second set is more recent. The rain hasn't smoothed the edge definition as much. She pulled out her phone and photographed them. Demko's radio came back with a response from dispatch. He listened, and Ethan watched his face. There's a farmhouse, Demko said. Abandoned property, estate in probate. It's been listed as pending renovation for 2 years. County road maintenance crew flagged it last month for a structural assessment that never got scheduled. He looked up. It's 1.4 miles northeast. Ranger was already looking northeast. He hadn't been given the information. He didn't need it. His tail was up. Back at the station, Ava had been moved to an interior room, quieter, warmer, a small conference room that smelled like stale coffee and dry erase markers. Someone had brought her a proper meal from the diner down the block, eggs and toast that she'd eaten most of. A female officer named Torres had been assigned to sit with her, which Ava understood was either because they were concerned for her welfare or because they didn't want her doing anything on her own. Probably both. Torres was around 30, with the kind of careful, non-intrusive presence that suggested she'd spent time working with kids in difficult circumstances. She didn't try to make conversation, but she was there, reading something on her phone, occasionally looking up, never making Ava feel watched the way some adults did, like she was a problem to be monitored. Ava had her phone. The battery was at 8% because she'd been using it to call her mother's number every few hours for 3 days, even knowing it went straight to voicemail. She'd stopped doing that. Instead, she sat with the phone in her lap and thought about the notebook. She'd found it on Friday in her mother's desk drawer, sandwiched between a utility bill and a stack of empty envelopes. She'd recognized it immediately. The dark blue cover, the way the spiral was slightly bent from being carried in a jacket pocket. Her mother always had it. Meetings, phone calls, even grocery runs when she said she needed to remember something. It was the most constant object in the house after the wheelchair charger and the coffee maker. She'd read some of it on Friday night. Not all of it. Some of the numbers and codes didn't make sense to her, and she'd gotten tired and fallen asleep with the notebook on the pillow beside her. But she'd read enough to understand that her mother had been watching something at work and that it worried her. She'd read the line about numbers that don't match, and she'd thought about the night her mother had closed the laptop fast and then spent 20 minutes being very cheerful about dinner in a way that wasn't quite her normal cheerful. She thought about it now. Her mother was not a dramatic person. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't catastrophize. When Ava had been diagnosed, or rather, when they'd been given the formal language to put around something they'd already been living with, her mother had cried for about 4 minutes and then started researching equipment options and physical therapy schedules with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that the practical is the antidote to the overwhelming. That was Rachel Bennett. She assessed, she planned, and she moved. If Rachel Bennett was scared of something, it was because that something was real. And if she hadn't come home for 3 days, it wasn't because she'd chosen not to. Ava knew this the way she knew her own name. It was not a hope or a theory. It was a fact she had been carrying around for 3 days while adults asked her gentle questions and told her they were looking into it and then presumably did other things. She looked at Torres. "Can I ask you something?" Torres put her phone down. "Sure." When they found her car, the Willow Ridge barn, was there any sign of... She stopped, reformulated. Was she there? Torres was quiet for a moment. Her belongings were found. She wasn't there. But they're still looking. Yes. With Ethan and Ranger. Yes. Ava turned this over. Her hands moved slightly on the armrests the way they sometimes did when she was thinking, a self-regulating motion, rhythmic, that she'd stopped noticing years ago. The officer from this morning, Demko, had shown a kind of recalibration when she'd said the thing about the wheelchair charger. She'd watched it happen. The slight change in posture, the way he'd turned to look at her more directly, the way the room had shifted its attention. She hadn't said it for effect. She'd said it because it was true, and because it was the truest argument she had. But she'd also understood at 12, in the particular fluent way that people who've spent their lives being underestimated develop fluency in reading rooms. She'd understood that the thing most likely to make adults take her seriously was the specific, undeniable detail, not the emotional appeal. She'd been working with that understanding since she was about 7. The door opened and a man she hadn't seen before came in. Civilian clothes, older. He carried a notepad and had the look of someone accustomed to asking questions rather than answering them. He introduced himself as Hargrove. "I know you've already told this to Officer Demko," he said, sitting down across from her. "But I'd like to hear it from you. The notebook, where you found it, and anything your mother said to you in the last few weeks about her work. Take your time." Ava looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "How much time do we have?" Hargrove glanced at Torres, then back at Ava. "We should move quickly." "Then I'll be fast," she said, "because I remember most of what she said." And she was. She laid it out in order. Dates, what her mother had said. The specific phrase about numbers not matching the farms. The night with the laptop. The way her mother had started parking in the back of the grocery lot instead of the front, which was something she'd never done before because it made unloading the groceries harder with the wheelchair. Hargrove wrote steadily. He didn't interrupt her. He asked 2 clarifying questions, and they were the right 2 questions. When she was done, the room was quiet for a moment. "You have a very good memory," Hargrove said. "My mom always said it's because I listen when people think I'm not." He looked at her. Something in his expression adjusted. Not pity, which she was practiced at deflecting, but something closer to recalibration. The same thing Demko had done. She was getting used to it today. "There's one other thing," Ava said. "What's that?" 3 weeks ago, she said something at dinner. I was eating, and she was on her laptop, and she said it kind of to herself. Not really to me." Ava paused. She said, Martin wouldn't let this happen. And then she closed the laptop and asked me how school was. Hargrove's pen had stopped moving. "Martin," he repeated. "I don't know who Martin is. I just know she said it like she was thinking about telling someone and talking herself out of it." Hargrove looked down at his notepad. His expression had gone carefully neutral in the specific way of someone managing a reaction. "Thank you, Ava," he said. He stood. "We're working on finding your mother. The information you've given us is genuinely useful. I mean that." He was at the door when she said, "Hargrove." He turned. "Martin who?" she asked. A beat. Not long, but present. "Martin Voss," he said. "He's the director of the cooperative." He left. Torres was watching the closed door. Ava looked at her hands on the armrests. Martin Voss, director of the cooperative, the man who would have signed off on invoices, the man with access to delivery records, to billing accounts, to the financial architecture that Rachel had been quietly mapping in a small blue notebook she carried everywhere, the man whose name her mother had said like a prayer that hadn't been answered. Ava's phone buzzed in her lap. She looked at it automatically. Habit from 3 days of checking, 3 days of hoping, and for a second she thought it was her mother's number. It wasn't. It was a notification from the phone's weather app. Temperature dropping. Overnight forecast. Heavy rain, possible freezing at elevation. She looked at the window. The rain was still going. Wherever her mother was, she'd been in this weather for 3 days. Ava set the phone down carefully and did not let herself think past the next hour. Torres said quietly, "They're good at this. Ethan and the dog." "I know," Ava said. "How do you know? You just met him." Ava was quiet for a moment. "Because when I was on the pavement outside and I couldn't get up and nobody was stopping, the dog stopped first. And then Ethan stopped because the dog stopped, but the dog stopped because of me." She looked at her hands. "That means the dog was paying attention to me when nobody else was. And Ethan trusts the dog." She paused. "That tells you something about a person." Torres looked at her for a long moment. She didn't have anything to add to that. Outside, somewhere on a county road, 4 miles northeast of where Ranger had put his nose into the air and started running, a farmhouse sat in the rain with its windows dark. Ranger was already running when Demko called it in. Not sprinting. The dog didn't sprint on a trail. That was movie nonsense. That was what people who'd never watched a working dog operate imagined it looked like. What Ranger did was shift into a faster, more committed version of the same ground-covering trot, his nose up now rather than down, reading the air column above the road rather than the surface, which meant the scent was strong enough and recent enough to be carrying. His tail was high and still, not wagging. That was the other thing people got wrong, the tail. A working dog on a hot trail didn't wag. The tail went up like an antenna and stayed there, rigid, a physical expression of locked-in focus. Ethan ran with him, not comfortable. His left knee had a plate in it from a training accident in 2019, and wet cold was not its preferred environment, but functional. He'd learned years ago to sort pain into categories, pain that means stop and pain that means continue. The knee was firmly in the second category, and he filed it there and moved. Demko and Fitch came behind in the cruiser, moving slow on the county road to stay parallel. The road was narrow, and the shoulder was muddy grass, and Ethan stayed on the shoulder rather than the road itself because Ranger was tracking along the edge, not the center, which told him Rachel, or whoever had transported her, had traveled this way on foot at some point, not just by vehicle. A vehicle trail and a foot trail, overlapping, which complicated the read but also told a story. She'd been mobile. Recently. That mattered. The trees on either side of the county road were second-growth Douglas fir with sword fern underneath, dark and dripping. The rain had gone from steady to intermittent in the last 20 minutes, which was typical for late November in the valley. It didn't stop so much as pause and reconsider. The light was flat and gray, the kind of light that made distance hard to gauge, and everything looked slightly closer than it was. At 1.1 miles, Ranger slowed. Not stopped. Slowed and began casting, those wider arcs that Ethan read as the scent pool thinning or splitting. He gave the dog room and watched the casts, reading the geometry. The scent was still there. It had just changed direction. A dirt track on the right. Almost invisible from the road. No signage, the entrance partially blocked by a wild rhododendron that had grown across it until someone had pushed through it recently, breaking several branches. The breaks were fresh. The wood was pale where it had snapped, not weathered. Ranger went right. "Track," Ethan called back to the cruiser. He pointed. Demko stopped, rolled down the window. "How far in?" "Don't know. He's committed." A pause. "I can't take the cruiser in there." "Then you're on foot." Demko and Fitch got out. Demko was on the radio as he moved, requesting additional units to the county road position, giving the cross-reference. His voice had the flat, controlled quality of someone managing the gap between what they have and what the situation requires. The dirt track wound for about 200 meters through the trees before it opened onto a clearing. The farmhouse sat at the far edge of it, a two-story structure, older, white paint going gray and peeling, a covered porch that sagged on one end, all the windows dark. A detached garage to one side, door down. A yard that had gone to high grass and blackberry cane, everything soaked and bent with the rain. Ranger stopped at the tree line. Ethan stopped with him. He didn't need to command it. The dog's hesitation was informational, not fear. Something in the scent picture had changed at this distance. He was reading it. Then he sat. Clean, deliberate. The alert. She was here. Ethan turned and looked at Demko, who had come up to his right shoulder. Fitch was on the left, slightly further back. "She's in there," Ethan said. Demko looked at the farmhouse. He was running the same calculation Ethan was running. Structure entry, unknown interior, unknown occupancy, one confirmed missing person who may or may not be the only person present. "I need more units before we breach," Demko said. "How long?" 8 to 12 minutes. That's a long time." "I'm aware of that." Ethan looked at the farmhouse. No movement in the windows, no light, no vehicle visible in the yard, though the garage door was down and whatever was in there was not visible. "Garage," Ethan said. Demko followed his eye line. "If someone transported her here, there's a vehicle. It's not in the yard. Either they left, or it's in there." Ethan kept his voice low. "If they left, she's in the house alone and we're standing out here in the rain. If they didn't leave, then we wait for backup." Demko. "I'm not sending 3 people into an unknown structure without 2 people and a dog, and you have no idea what her condition is." The word condition landed in the space between them with its full weight. 3 days. November cold. A woman who'd been moved at least once, possibly more. Medical conditions that a 12-year-old girl hadn't mentioned, but that stress and exposure could trigger in anyone. Demko made a sound low in his throat. "Not agreement, recalculation. We don't breach," he said. "We approach. We establish contact. We assess. Nobody goes through a door until I say so." "Fine." "I mean it, Calloway." "I heard you." They moved across the clearing in a spread formation, Fitch going wide left toward the garage, Demko and Ethan approaching the house from an angle that kept them out of the direct line of the front windows. Ranger moved close at Ethan's left knee, off the line, the way he'd been trained to work in CQB-adjacent approaches, not ahead and not pulling, matching Ethan's pace and vector. The porch steps were soft with rot. Ethan tested the first one with his weight before committing. It held. The second was worse, but held too. Demko came up behind him and they stacked briefly at the front door. Not a tactical stack. There was no equipment for that, no earpieces or hand signals established, no breach tools. Just 2 men at a door with a dog between them and 3 days of missing woman on the other side. Demko knocked. Loud, authoritative, the specific cadence of law enforcement that was recognizable even without the words. Pine Hollow Police. Anyone inside, make yourself known. Silence. Rain on the porch roof. Demko tried the handle. Locked. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Ranger. Ranger's nose was at the gap at the base of the door. His tail had dropped slightly from the full-up position. Not losing the scent, adjusting for proximity, the way dogs do when the source is close enough that the trail dynamics change. He made the low sound again, that vocalization that wasn't quite a whine, the one Ethan had only ever heard him make on the hottest, closest trails. "She's right on the other side of this door," Ethan said. Demko's radio crackled. Fitch's voice. "Garage door has a side window. There's a vehicle in there, dark pickup. Can't read the plates from here." The temperature of the situation shifted again, in the way that Ethan had learned to read not as an escalation, but as a crystallization. The moment when the variables collapse into a smaller set of possibilities, each one clearer and more pressurized than what came before. If the vehicle was here, whoever had driven it here might still be here. Or they'd left on foot, which in this terrain and this weather was its own kind of statement. Demko made the decision. You could see it happen. The brief internal calculation, the weight assigned to each variable, the acceptance of the liability that came with the choice. "We go in," he said. "Fitch, stay on the garage and watch the vehicle. Do not approach alone." He drew his sidearm. Ethan had nothing. He was a civilian with a leash. He stepped to the side of the door and gave Demko the angle, and watched Demko take one step back and drive his heel into the door just below the handle, the way that actually works on older doors with worn frames. Not the center mass Hollywood kick, but the mechanical point right at the latch housing. The door gave on the second kick. The smell hit Ethan before the visual registered. Damp wood and mildew and something else. The particular dense, closed-in smell of a space that's been occupied recently, that has body heat and food and human presence layered into the air. It wasn't bad. It wasn't the smell of something terrible. It was the smell of someone who had been here, living in this space, for more than a few hours. The front room was empty. Bare wood floors, no furniture except a single folding chair, and a sleeping bag open flat on the floor with a fleece blanket bunched at one end. A battery-powered lantern, switched off. 2 empty water bottles and a granola bar wrapper. Someone had been here, and whoever it was had been minimally supplied, but not nothing. Someone had made sure she wouldn't die of thirst or hypothermia, which was its own kind of information, suggesting someone who wanted her present but not dead, which meant leverage rather than elimination, which was a colder kind of situation in some ways, but better in others. Demko moved right. Ethan moved left, Ranger at his side. The hallway. 3 doors, one open. A bathroom, empty. One closed on the left. One closed at the end. Ranger went left. Directly to the closed door on the left. He sat. Ethan put his hand on the knob. "Rachel Bennett," he said. His voice was level. Not shouting, not soft. The specific middle register that carries through a door without sounding like threat. "My name is Ethan Calloway. I'm a volunteer working with Pine Hollow Police. Your daughter sent us." A sound from inside. Movement. Something scraping. A chair or a person on a floor. Then a voice. Hoarse and compressed, pressed and unmistakably female. Is Ava? She's at the station. She's safe. She's been asking for you since Friday." A long pause. Then, "The door. There's a latch on your side, sliding bolt." Ethan looked. High on the doorframe, nearly at the top, a sliding bolt he'd missed in the low light. Not a lock so much as a way of keeping the door from being pushed open from the inside. He slid it and opened the door. The room was small. A former bedroom, bare walls, one window with the glass intact, and the view of the side yard. Rachel Bennett was on the floor against the far wall. She'd been sitting with her back to it and had gotten to her feet when she heard the knock, but she was moving carefully, the way people move when they've been in one position for a long time, and their body has made peace with it, and is now protesting the disruption. She was 34 and she looked it right now, maybe a few years more. Her hair was tangled and her face was drawn, and she had the specific pallor of someone who'd been afraid for an extended period and had run through the adrenaline and come out the other side into something flatter and more enduring. Her jacket was still on. She'd slept in it, but she was standing. And when she looked past Ethan and saw Ranger, something in her face broke apart in a way that had nothing to do with fear.
A dog, she said. It wasn't even a complete sentence. It was a sound. Demko was already on his radio. He called it in with the specific compressed efficiency of someone delivering information that has been waited for. Bennett, Rachel, found alive, entering 40 hours, requesting medical assessment at location and transport. He gave the address. He gave his badge number. He said confirmed twice and clicked off. Rachel's eyes were on Ethan.
You said Ava sent you. She did. She's at the station. She's not. She wheeled herself 2 miles through the rain this morning to report you missing. He kept his voice straight. She's fine. She's been sitting with the notebook you left in your desk, and she's been telling anyone who would listen exactly what you found. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something different in them. Not relief exactly, or not just relief. Something closer to the particular emotion that comes when you find out that the person you were most worried about was, in fact, the one holding everything together. The notebook, she said. Does Hargrove know? Ethan went still. Hargrove. You know Hargrove? Financial crime. County Sheriff's Office. She was moving now, steadying herself against the wall, getting her legs under her. I called him 6 weeks ago, before any of this. I found the first invoice discrepancy in September, and I didn't know who to trust inside the cooperative, so I went outside. He told me to keep documenting, keep my head down, don't tell anyone inside. She paused. I don't think he knew it would go this far this fast. Ethan was recalibrating. He looked at Demko, who had the expression of someone who's just discovered that the map he's been using has additional features he wasn't told about. You were working with Hargrove already, Demko said, for 6 weeks. Rachel got herself to standing, fully upright. She was shaky, but she was upright. Martin Voss figured it out. I don't know how. I was careful. But 3 days ago, he called me into his office after hours, and 2 of his people were there, and they made it clear that disappearing for a while was in my interest. She looked at the floor. They drove me here in the dark. One of them stayed the first night and then left. They left water and some food. They told me not to make noise, and the nearest house was 4 miles away, and I believed them. Were you threatened directly? Not with a word. Nobody said anything specific. They didn't have to. She met Demko's eyes. Martin Voss has been running this cooperative for 11 years. He knows everyone in this county. The banks, the county assessors, the people who make decisions about water rights and equipment loans for every farm family in a 30-mile radius. He didn't need to say the word. She swallowed. He just needed me to understand that the cooperative was bigger than any one person's concern about the numbers. The room was very quiet for a moment. He made a mistake, Ethan said. Rachel looked at him. He didn't know about Ava. They brought Rachel out through the front door and into the gray afternoon light, and Ethan let Ranger approach her properly. Not the working approach. The other one, the one the dog chose for himself when a person needed it. And Rachel went to her knees on the wet porch steps and put both hands on either side of Ranger's face, and the dog leaned into her like a counterweight, and she held on for a long moment without saying anything. Ethan stood back and gave it space. Demko was on the phone. Fitch had come around from the garage and was running the pickup's plates on her terminal. She looked up at Ethan and mouthed something he couldn't quite read and then said quietly, "Registered to a company called HV Land Management LLC, Portland address." She paused. Same city as North Valley Storage. Ethan nodded once. The backup units arrived 9 minutes later, 2 sheriff's department vehicles and a county medical responder. The medic assessed Rachel efficiently. Dehydration, mild hypothermia indicators, elevated stress markers, nothing structural. She needed fluids and warmth and rest and time. She was going to be fine. She said this herself before the medic finished. "I'm fine. I need to talk to Hargrove." "Ma'am, we need to get you." I know, but I need 5 minutes with Hargrove first." She looked at Demko. "Please." Demko called it in. Hargrove arrived 18 minutes after that. He pulled up in his unmarked sedan and got out and walked to where Rachel was sitting in the back of the medical responder's vehicle with the door open and a foil thermal blanket around her shoulders. And the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who have been working a problem from different angles for 2 months and have just arrived, through a route neither of them planned, at the same point. "I'm sorry," Hargrove said. "This shouldn't have gotten to this point." "No,"
Rachel said. It shouldn't have. We're moving on Voss today. We've had enough for 2 weeks. We were waiting on one additional document from the Portland filing to close the shell company chain. We have it now. Rachel was quiet for a moment. How much? Over the 18 months we've documented, approximately $340,000, diverted from cooperative farm accounts through fraudulent delivery invoices billed to North Valley Storage and 2 other shell entities. Rachel looked at the foil blanket on her lap. Those are farming families, she said. Some of those people have been members of that cooperative for 30 years. They were paying into a fund that was supposed to protect them, and he was... She stopped. He was, Hargrove said. And now he's done. He straightened. He looked at Ethan, who was standing a few feet away with Ranger beside him. You found her, Hargrove said. The dog found her. You found the dog. It was a strange thing to say, and they both knew it, and neither of them pursued it. Hargrove nodded once, the minimal acknowledgement of one professional to another, and went to talk to Demko. Ethan looked at Rachel. She was watching him with the focused, clear-eyed attention of someone who has been afraid for 3 days and is in the process of putting the fear away, filing it somewhere it can be examined later when there's room for it. Ava said, "Please find my mom," he said. That was the first thing she said to me. She was lying on the pavement outside the station in the rain. Rachel's jaw tightened. She wheeled 2 miles. Yeah. In November. Yeah. She looked away for a moment. When she looked back, there was something in her eyes that wasn't going to resolve itself into a simple emotion anytime soon. It was too large and too mixed for that, composed of too many things at once. Pride and guilt and love and the specific complicated feeling of knowing that someone you were trying to protect ended up being the one who protected you. She's 12, Rachel said. She has cerebral palsy. That route has a highway crossing with no pedestrian signal. I know. And she decided, Ethan said. Nobody told her to. Nobody was going to help her if she stayed home. So she went. He paused. She's something, your daughter. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. The drive back to Pine Hollow took 25 minutes. Rachel rode in the medical responder's vehicle. Ethan and Ranger rode in Demko's cruiser again, same configuration as the morning. Ranger between Ethan's knees, the town coming up, gray and wet, through the rain-streaked window. The difference was that this time Ethan knew where they were going and what they were bringing back. He let himself be tired for a few minutes. Just that. Not relief, not satisfaction, just the particular flat exhaustion that follows a period of sustained operational focus when the immediate objective is achieved. He was familiar with it. It usually felt like pressure leaving a room, slow and quiet, the atmosphere adjusting. His knee ached. He'd deal with that later. Ranger had his head on Ethan's thigh. His eyes were open, but his breathing had gone slow and even, the deep-down relaxation of a working dog that has completed what it set out to do. He didn't care about the human layers of the story, the fraud, the shell companies, the county politics, the 11 years of Martin Voss moving money from farm families into his own accounts. None of that registered. What registered was the scent and the trail, and the place the trail ended, and the person on the other side of the door, and the fact that all of it had resolved correctly. For Ranger, that was enough. Ethan wished, not for the first time, that his own architecture was that clean. His phone had 1 bar of signal out here, and he didn't try to use it. He looked out the window and thought of the wheelchair on its side, the spinning wheel, the girl on the wet pavement with her cheek against the asphalt, and the notebook pressed to her body like something worth dying for. He didn't rescue me. He listened to me. He hadn't heard her say that. He wouldn't hear it for months. But if he had heard it this afternoon, riding back through the wet Oregon landscape with his dog's weight on his leg and the town appearing in pieces through the trees, he might have said something honest back. He hadn't listened, exactly. Ranger had listened. He'd just been paying attention to the dog. The Pine Hollow police station came up on the left. Demko parked. They got out. The rain had pulled back to a mist, the kind that didn't feel like rain but put moisture on your face anyway, the kind that got in between things. Ethan held the door. Ranger walked in ahead of him. From the conference room at the back, the small room, the one with the stale coffee smell and the dry erase markers, came the sound of a chair. Not a wheelchair. A regular chair being pushed back fast on linoleum. Then Torres's voice.
controlled, professional, with a note of something that wasn't quite either of those things. Ava! Ava! Wait! And then the door opened, and Ava Bennett came through it in her wheelchair, moving faster than a wheelchair was supposed to move in an indoor space. Her hands working the rims with a competence that Ethan suspected most people who encountered her never stopped to notice. And she went straight past the front desk and past Briggs, who stepped back without being asked. And she got to the front entrance and she stopped. Because Rachel was just coming through it. The medical responder had her by the arm, more support than necessity, and Rachel's thermal blanket had slipped off one shoulder and her hair was still a disaster, and she was moving carefully on legs that hadn't walked far in 3 days. But she was walking. And Ava was there. The sound Ava made was not crying exactly. It was the sound that comes before crying, the involuntary intake that happens when the thing you have been holding yourself together for stops requiring you to hold yourself together. 3 days of careful, deliberate, functional determination. 3 days of managing logistics and managing adults and managing the specific terror of not knowing. And then her mother was in the doorway, and the thing that had been holding her rigid released all at once. Rachel crossed the space between them and went to her knees on the linoleum, which was undignified, and she didn't care at all. And she got her arms around her daughter, and Ava's arms went around her mother, and they stayed like that while the station moved around them with professional discretion. People looking at paperwork, at monitors, at the wall, anywhere that wasn't this moment, which was not for them. Ranger sat beside them. Just sat. Not touching, not seeking attention, present. Ethan stood near the door with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched. He'd been part of operations that cost things. That ended badly. That ended well, but left marks that didn't resolve. He'd been part of things he still didn't talk about, not because he'd been ordered not to, but because there weren't good words for them in regular conversation. And the regular words that existed for them were wrong in ways that bothered him more than the silence. This was not that. This was a woman on a linoleum floor with her arms around her kid, and it was simple, and it was complete, and it was the best version of how this particular story could have ended. He noticed Demko beside him. "Good work," Demko said. He didn't say it like a performance. He said it the way people who rarely say it say it. "Ranger worked," Ethan said. "Yeah." A pause. "Both of you." Across the room, Hargrove had come in behind Rachel and was already on his phone, moving toward the far corner with the focused forward lean of someone managing multiple things simultaneously. From the fragments Ethan caught, Voss had been located. The warrant had been expedited. There were people moving on the cooperative's financial records with the specific quiet efficiency that financial crimes operations use when they've been patient for 2 months and are now done being patient. Ava pulled back from her mother and looked at her face for a moment the way you look at something you're verifying, checking each feature against the stored record, confirming the match. Then she looked over Rachel's shoulder and found Ethan across the room. She didn't say anything, neither did he, but she held his gaze for a long moment, and it was the look of someone who has just learned something important about what a person can be. Not a category or a type, not the adult who helps or the authority who listens, but something more specific and harder to name. The look of someone updating their understanding. Then Rachel said something quiet in her daughter's ear, and Ava looked at her mother again, and the moment closed. Outside, through the station's glass front, the mist had thickened back toward real rain. The mountains were still invisible. The traffic light on Carver Street blinked its yellow rhythm into the wet afternoon, same as it had that morning, same as it would tomorrow. Pine Hollow looked the way it always looked in November. But the notebook was in Hargrove's hands, the trail had been run to its end, and the woman who'd spent 6 weeks quietly building the case that would undo 11 years of Martin Voss's careful theft was sitting on a police station floor in a foil blanket with her daughter in her arms. Ranger put his nose on Ethan's hand. Ethan scratched behind his ear once, the specific spot the dog liked, and Ranger's tail moved, just once, low and slow. That was enough. The station didn't empty out so much as reconfigure. The immediate urgency, the compressed, forward-leaning momentum of a search in progress, drained out of the room the way it always did when the objective was achieved, leaving behind something slower and more procedural. Forms to be filled, statements to be taken, a chain of custody for the notebook that required Hargrove's signature in 3 places, a medical release for Rachel that the responder needed before she could formally hand off care. The specific administrative weight of a situation that had resolved correctly and now required documentation of exactly how correctly it had resolved. Rachel and Ava were moved back to the conference room, not separated. There was no reason to separate them, and Demko wasn't going to try. Rachel sat at the table with Ava beside her and a cup of real coffee that Demko had made himself from the good grounds he kept in his desk drawer for situations that warranted it. And the medical responder checked her blood pressure twice and her temperature once, and wrote things on a clipboard and said the word hospital in a tone that left room for negotiation. "I'll go tomorrow," Rachel said. "Tonight I'm going home." "Ma'am, you've been exposed to... I've been in a cold room for 3 days. I'm dehydrated and I'm tired." She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "I have a daughter who needs to sleep in her own bed. I need to sleep in mine. I'll go to urgent care tomorrow morning and I'll let them run whatever they want to run." The responder looked at Demko. Demko looked at Rachel. "You sign a refusal form," he said. "I'll sign 2, she said. He almost smiled. It was a very small, almost smile, the kind that happens when a person's professional composure has a momentary gap in it, but it happened. Ethan was in the hallway outside the conference room door. He hadn't gone in. He'd gotten Ranger a bowl of water from the bathroom and then found a chair near the hallway wall and sat in it, and nobody had asked him to move or to leave, which he interpreted as tacit permission to exist in this space for a little while longer. His knee had stiffened in the cold, and he was working it slowly, small, deliberate flexes, feeling the plate complain and then adjust. He could hear pieces of what was happening in the conference room without trying to. The building's walls were not thick, and the door was not fully closed. Hargrove's voice, measured and precise. Rachel's voice, steadier than it had any business being after 3 days in a farmhouse floor. Ava's voice, quieter but present, occasionally offering a date or a specific phrase from the notebook that she'd retained with the accuracy of someone who'd been reading it repeatedly for 2 days. At one point, Hargrove said, "The 2 individuals who transported you, can you describe the vehicle?" And Rachel said, "Dark green pickup, Ram 1500, I think. I'm not good with trucks. There was a dent on the driver's side rear panel and a cracked taillight." A pause. Then Hargrove said, "That matches the vehicle in the garage." Then nothing for a while. Ethan looked at Ranger, who had finished his water and was now lying on his side in the hallway with the boneless, maximum contact sprawl of a dog that has decided the floor is exactly soft enough and has no further opinions. His chest rose and fell. His paws twitched once. The door opened and Hargrove came out. He stopped when he saw Ethan. He looked at Ranger, then back at Ethan. He seemed to be deciding something. "Walk with me," he said. They went to the far end of the hallway, away from the conference room door. Hargrove had the posture of a man who has been moving fast for several hours and is now operating on competent autopilot, which was its own kind of tired. 2 men connected to Voss's operation were picked up 40 minutes ago at the Route 9 junction, Hargrove said. They were in a second vehicle, a rental. They hadn't gone far. "Going back to close loose ends?" "We think so. We don't know exactly what they intended. We know they were in contact with Voss as recently as 2 hours ago." He paused. "Voss was at his home address. He didn't run. He opened the door for the deputies, asked if he could call his attorney, and went with them without a word." Ethan thought about that. A man who'd spent 11 years carefully constructing a financial architecture that distributed $60,000 of fraudulent billing annually knew exactly when the architecture had failed. He'd had attorneys since before this morning. He'd probably made calls from the moment Hargrove's people started pulling records. "He'll fight it," Ethan said. "For years, probably. That's how these things go." Hargrove didn't sound bothered by it. But the documentation Rachel built, 6 weeks of invoice cross-referencing, delivery confirmation requests, shell company tracking. It's thorough. She's an accountant. She documented it the way an accountant documents things, which is to say, completely. "She was working with you the whole time." "Yes." "Demko didn't know." "No. The fewer people who knew, the better. Voss has relationships in this county that go deep. We needed it to be tight." He paused. I didn't anticipate him moving on Rachel directly. The timeline accelerated faster than our evidence collection. That's on me. Ethan let that sit. It was an honest admission from someone who didn't make a habit of them publicly, and he recognized it as such. "She's not pressing that point," Ethan said. "No, she's not. Hargrove looked at the floor briefly. She's protective of the case. She knows what pressing it could cost in terms of the prosecution optics. She's protecting the farming families. Yes, she's been doing that since September. A door opened at the far end of the hall, and Fitch came through it with a tablet and a focused expression and a direct path toward Hargrove that didn't include acknowledgement of Ethan, which was fine and appropriate. Ethan stepped back. Fitch lowered her voice when she reached Hargrove, but the hallway's acoustics were what they were. Portland office pulled the North Valley storage registration. Shell goes 3 layers. North Valley to HV Land Management to a holding company called Crestfield Agricultural Partners, registered in Delaware. Crestfield has 4 listed officers. 3 are names we're running now. She paused. The 4th is Martin Voss. The silence was brief. Of course it is, Hargrove said. His attorney's already filed an intent to contest the search of the cooperative's records. Let him. The records were subpoenaed 36 hours ago with county court authorization. The attorney can contest whatever he wants from whatever distance he prefers. Fitch nodded once and went back the way she'd come. Hargrove looked at Ethan. The cooperative had 340 member farms, he said. At the current loss rate, the diversion would have cost the membership collectively somewhere between $180,000 and $210,000 per year, distributed across accounts in amounts small enough to avoid triggering internal audit flags. He paused. Some of those families are running on margins that make $5,000 a year, the difference between staying and selling. Ethan didn't say anything. Rachel knew that, Hargrove said. That's why she called me in September instead of going to the cooperative's internal board, where Voss controlled 3 of 5 votes. He looked back toward the conference room. She knew the internal route was closed. She found the right external route. She documented everything. She kept her head down for 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. And then a 12-year-old girl with cerebral palsy wheeled herself 2 miles through a November rainstorm with her mother's notebook under her jacket. Ethan said nothing. You were just walking your dog, Hargrove said. Ranger was walking himself. I was keeping up. Hargrove looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man filing something away. Thank you, he said. It was direct and unadorned and meant precisely what it said. He went back toward the conference room. Demko found Ethan 20 minutes later, still in the hallway chair, Ranger still on the floor beside him. Demko had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, and the look of someone who had completed the required paperwork and was now dealing with the residue. He pulled the chair from the opposite wall and sat in it with the particular care of a man whose back was reminding him of its opinion. Briggs wants to write you up for the dog, he said. I figured. I told him the dog had retired service animal documentation and the situation was exigent. He paused. He's 26. He'll learn when exigent applies. Ethan looked at the wall. You were SEAL for how long? Demko asked. 14 years. What team? 3. Demko absorbed that. Your knee, combat. Training accident 2019, offshore qualification evolution, rock landing. He paused. Everybody says the deployment injuries get you, but half the time it's the training. Infantry, Demko said. 2 tours, Helmand, left knee and my left ear. He touched the side of his head briefly. I hear fine. I just hear everything shifted about 15% to the right. They sat with that for a moment. 2 men in a hallway who had each been shaped by things that didn't come up easily in regular conversation, not avoiding the subject, just not needing to press on it. The girl, Demko said. Yeah. You know, she ran me through about 45 seconds of the most precise missing persons brief I've had in this job. He was looking at the floor. From a 12-year-old, in a blanket, eating eggs. She's been running it in her head for 3 days, Ethan said. She rehearsed for the moment someone would actually listen. I should have listened Friday. Yes. Demko didn't look up. I know. Briggs took the call Friday. I know that too. He rubbed the back of his neck. I supervised Briggs. That means the call was mine. Ethan let that be what it was. He wasn't going to tell the man he was wrong to sit with it. After a moment, Demko said, The route she took. Maple Creek Road to here. There's a stretch near the highway crossing where the shoulder disappears for about a quarter mile. Nothing between the road and the traffic. He paused. In the dark, in the rain, in a wheelchair. She went Sunday morning, Ethan said, after the sun was up. Not dark. Still. Still, Ethan agreed. Ranger made a sound in his sleep. Not distress. More like the vocal punctuation of something working itself out in a dream. His pause moved briefly and then stilled. You gonna be around? Demko asked. I live here. I know you live here. I mean, he seemed to be deciding how to phrase it. The case is going to take a while. Hargrove's going to need people who know what happened today in a sequence that holds up. I may need a formal statement about your role, the dog's alerts, the track from the barn, to the service road to the farmhouse. I'll give you
Whatever you need. And the girl, he paused, and her mother. They're going to be in this county through all of it. Through the prosecution, through the cooperative restructuring, through however long it takes. He looked at Ethan sideways. People who go through something like this sometimes need more than formal support structures. Ethan looked at him. I'm not suggesting anything, Demko said, too quickly, which suggested he was suggesting something. I'm not good at... Ethan started. I'm not asking you to be good at anything. I'm just noting that you stayed when you could have left. Demko stood, which is its own kind of information about a person. He went back down the hallway. Ethan sat with that for a while. Rachel's formal statement took 2 hours. Hargrove ran it with a county DA's investigator who had arrived from Eugene at 5:30 and had the aggressive, efficient manner of someone who drove 90 minutes to do a specific job and was not interested in wasting the trip. She asked questions in precise sequence, building the timeline from Rachel's first invoice discrepancy in September to the meeting in Voss's office 3 days ago to the room in the farmhouse. Rachel answered without hesitating. She was tired, genuinely tired, the deep-down kind that coffee doesn't touch. But her memory was intact and her accounting instincts were intact, and she gave the investigator exactly what she needed in the order she needed it, invoice numbers and dates and the specific language Voss had used in the after-hours meeting that had allowed him to make a direct threat without technically making one. Ava sat beside her for most of it. When the investigator asked whether Ava should wait outside, Rachel said no. Ava said nothing. The investigator assessed the situation and moved on. At one point, the investigator asked about the notebook. You maintained independent records rather than relying on the cooperative systems, she said. Why? Because the cooperative systems were what was being manipulated, Rachel said. Whatever I found in the system, whoever was doing this could alter. A physical notebook in my desk at home was outside the system. Did you tell anyone at the cooperative what you'd found? No. Not even colleagues you trusted? Rachel paused. I trusted the numbers I was looking at. I didn't know yet who else I could trust. She looked at her hands on the table. That's a lonely position to be in. How long did you maintain it? 6 weeks from when I called Hargrove. About 2 weeks before that, when I was still trying to figure out if I was reading it correctly. So nearly 2 months alone with this information. Nearly 2 months, Rachel said. Yes. The investigator wrote something down. Ava, who had been quiet for the last 40 minutes, said, She didn't tell me either. The investigator looked up. She was protecting me, Ava said. I knew something was wrong. I could tell. But she didn't tell me because she didn't want me to be scared. She looked at her mother. I was scared anyway. Rachel looked at her daughter. I know, she said. I'm sorry. I'm not saying you were wrong. Ava's hands moved on her armrests. I'm saying I was scared, and I didn't tell you I was scared because I didn't want you to worry. So we were both scared and not telling each other. She paused. That was dumb. The investigator had put her pen down. She was watching the two of them with the careful stillness of someone trying not to disturb something that is happening in the room independent of her agenda. Rachel said, Yes, that was dumb. A beat. Then Ava said, We should talk about things. We should, Rachel said. Okay. Okay. The investigator picked her pen back up and looked at her notepad and said, I think that's everything I need for tonight, in the tone of someone who has just witnessed something that is not her business but has left a small impression anyway. The station had thinned by 7 o'clock. The sheriff's department vehicles were gone. Hargrove was back at the county office managing the operational side of what had become a coordinated multi-agency proceeding, and the Pine Hollow station had returned to its skeleton crew Sunday evening configuration with the addition of about 6 times the normal amount of paperwork. Torres offered to drive Rachel and Ava home. Rachel accepted.
Ethan was by the front door when they came out of the conference room. He had his jacket on and Ranger's leash in his hand, and he'd been planning to simply leave, to slip out while the station was busy and drive home and feed the dog and put ice on his knee and go to bed at 9 o'clock like a sensible person. But he was still there when they came through the door, so that plan hadn't entirely executed. Rachel stopped when she saw him. Ava's chair stopped too, slightly behind, because the doorway was narrow and they'd come through it single file. Rachel looked at him for a moment. She'd fixed her hair and someone had lent her a dry jacket, and she looked approximately like herself again, if a version of herself that had been through 3 days of something she was going to be processing for a long time. "I don't know how to," she started. "You don't need to," he said. "I do. You don't know what you—" "I was walking my dog," he said. "Ranger did the work." She looked at the dog. Ranger looked back at her with his characteristic undemonstrative steadiness, the quality that Ethan had once described to his physical therapist, inaccurately but not entirely wrong, as professional courtesy. "He's extraordinary," she said. "He'd be embarrassed if he understood the compliment." She almost laughed. It came out short and a little ragged around the edges, the kind of sound that's trying to be a laugh but has other things mixed into it. She pressed the back of her hand briefly to her mouth. Then she crouched down to Ranger's level, which she'd done at the farmhouse, and was apparently something she was going to keep doing because Ranger accepted it with the same dignity he accepted most things. She scratched behind his ear. He leaned in. "Thank you," she told the dog. Ranger's tail moved once. Ethan looked past Rachel to Ava. Ava was watching him with that particular focused quality she had, the one that processed things carefully before filing them. She'd been doing it all day, reading every room she was in, noting every shift in the adults around her, extracting information from expressions and pauses and the things that didn't get said. He wondered what she made of him, specifically. He was aware that he occupied a strange category. Not a relative, not an authority, not a neighbor or a family friend. A man who had been present, who had followed a dog down a county road in the rain. "You okay?" he asked her. Not "are you okay" in the rhetorical way, in the actual way. She considered it for a moment, which told him she was taking the question seriously. "I will be," she said. "I'm tired." "You should be. You've been awake longer than any of us." "I slept a little, Wednesday night." She paused. "Thursday I was too scared. Friday I was mad. Saturday I was planning." She looked down at her hands on the armrests. "Today I was just doing it." "That's the right sequence," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Is that how it works for you? When you were in the Navy?" He thought about it. "Pretty much. The fear doesn't go away. You just move it to a different room in your head and close the door. And it stays there? For long enough to do what you have to do." She was quiet for a moment. "And then later?" "Later you open the door and you deal with it." He paused. "Usually in the middle of the night, which is inconvenient." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not quite a smile, not quite not. Something in between that was hers specifically, the expression of someone who finds something both sad and usefully true at the same time. "Okay," she said. Rachel had straightened up. Torres was holding the outer door. The cold night air came through it, wet and clean, the mist having finally settled into something quiet. Rachel looked at Ethan one more time. "My name is Rachel," she said. "We never actually introduced ourselves." "Ethan." "I know." She paused. "Ava told me. On the floor when I first— She was already telling me about you, while I was still trying to stop crying." She looked at the floor briefly, then back at him. "She said you were the one who found her outside." "Ranger found her." "You keep saying that." "Because it's accurate." Rachel looked at the dog one more time, then at Ethan. Her expression had settled into something that wasn't trying to resolve into anything simpler than what it was. "Come for dinner," she said. "Next week. When we're settled. Bring Ranger." She paused. "You don't have to, but I'd like you to." He thought about his policy, the one about not getting involved in things that weren't his, the one he'd developed after the Navy, after the period he didn't talk about, the one he'd been quietly not following all day. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Torres herded them gently toward the door. Rachel and Ava went out into the night and the mist, and Torres followed, and the door closed behind them. Ethan stood in the empty doorway for a moment, Ranger pressed against his left leg. Not seeking attention, just there. The specific solid weight of an animal that has learned that his person sometimes needs something that doesn't require words and can be delivered by proximity. Ethan put his hand on the dog's back. Outside, through the glass, he could see the taillights of Torres's vehicle pulling out of the lot. The traffic light on Carver Street blinked its yellow rhythm into the wet air. The mountains were still not visible. They wouldn't be until the weather cleared, which might be 2 days or might be a week. He thought about a 12-year-old girl who had been afraid for 3 days and had converted the fear into a plan, and the plan into action, and the action into 2 miles of rain-soaked road because the alternative was staying home and doing nothing, which was not something she was built for. He thought about what Demko had said in the hallway. You stayed when you could have left, which is its own kind of information about a person. He'd stayed because Ranger had stayed. That was the honest answer, but he'd been paying attention to the dog for 8 years. That was also the honest answer. He pushed the door open and walked out into the mist, Ranger beside him, and the night closed around them both, quiet and cold, and carrying the smell of rain-soaked Douglas fir and river water, and the particular darkness of a small Oregon town in November that goes to bed early and doesn't ask too many questions about what happened during the day. His truck was parked at the far end of the lot. He took his time getting there. The knee allowed it. When he got in and started the engine and the heater kicked on, Ranger turned 3 times on the back seat and lay down with a sound like a person sighing at the end of a long and eventful day. Ethan pulled out of the lot. He didn't think about next week yet. That was the kind of thing you thought about in the middle of the night when the door opened. For now, he drove home through the wet, dark streets of Pine Hollow and didn't think about much at all. The heater in Ethan's truck had a rattle in it that he'd been meaning to fix since March. He'd gotten used to it the way you get used to most things that don't rise to the level of actual problem, filed it somewhere behind the oil change and the left rear wiper blade and the section of porch railing that had gone soft and needed replacing before it became a liability. The list of deferred maintenance in his life was not short. He'd been aware of this for a while without it translating into urgency. He thought about this on the drive home, because thinking about small practical failures was easier than thinking about everything else. The knee. The way Ava had looked at him from the doorway when Torres herded them out. The dinner invitation that Rachel had offered with the particular careful casualness of someone extending something real while leaving him room to treat it as nothing. He'd said, "Yeah, okay," which was not a word he used lightly, even when it sounded like he did. The house was cold when he got in. He'd left the heat at 58, which was the temperature he kept it at when he didn't expect to be gone all day. He turned it up, fed Ranger, put ice wrapped in a dish towel on his knee while he sat at the kitchen table and ate a bowl of cereal because it was 9:15 and he hadn't eaten since 6 in the morning, and cereal was what was in front of him. Ranger ate fast and then came and put his chin on the edge of the table and looked at Ethan. "You were good today," Ethan told him. Ranger's tail moved. "Don't let it go to your head." He finished the cereal. He put the bowl in the sink. "I went to bed at 9:47, which was the earliest he'd gone to bed in months, and he was asleep in approximately 4 minutes, which told him things about his own state that he was too tired to process. The door opened at 2:15 in the morning. Not literally. That was just when his brain, having filed everything into its appropriate categories during the first 4 hours of sleep, decided it was time to examine the contents. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and listened to Ranger breathing at the foot of the bed and thought about a girl on wet pavement outside a police station with a notebook pressed to her ribs like armor. He thought about 14 years and what they'd cost. The plate in his knee. The particular kind of quiet he'd chosen when he came back. Not because quiet was what he wanted, but because it was what he knew how to manage. The house that was technically too large for one person and one dog. The physical therapy appointments he kept rescheduling. The policy about not getting involved. He thought about the dog, who had stopped on a sidewalk in the rain because something required stopping and had not moved until it was addressed. At some point, he went back to sleep. He didn't remember exactly when. November became December. The cooperative investigation moved at the pace that financial crimes investigations move, which is to say, not fast, but with the kind of inexorable forward momentum that comes from excellent documentation and a prosecutor who had decided this was the case, she was going to win thoroughly rather than quickly. The indictment of Martin Voss came down 18 days after his arrest. fraud, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty. The two men who had transported Rachel, whose names turned out to be Decker and Palouche, both of whom had prior connections to HV Land Management LLC, were charged with unlawful imprisonment and criminal threatening. Decker took a plea arrangement in the first week of December. Palouche held out and then took a worse one in January. Voss's attorney filed 4 separate motions to suppress evidence in the first month. 3 were denied. 1 was still pending by February and had become the kind of procedural speed bump that delayed timelines but didn't change destinations. The DA's investigator, the one who'd driven 90 minutes from Eugene and asked precise questions, had told Rachel in December that the case was as solid as she'd seen in 8 years of financial crimes prosecution. "What does solid mean in terms of outcome?" Rachel had asked. "It means he'll eventually figure out that fighting it costs more than what he'd get from a favorable plea, and he'll take the plea." The investigator had paused. Men like Voss take a long time to understand that the game is over. It's usually a function of attorney bills. Rachel had passed this to Hargrove, who had said only yes in the tone of someone who has been through this before and has made peace with the pace. The cooperative itself had gone into a transitional management structure within 2 weeks of Voss's arrest. The County Agricultural Board appointed an interim director, a woman named Castellano from the State Agricultural Extension Office, sharp and humorless, and apparently exactly what was needed. And Castellano had spent the first 3 weeks pulling the financial architecture apart, thread by thread, and publishing the findings to the membership in weekly written summaries that were more detailed and more honest than anything the membership had received in 11 years. The reaction from the farming families was not simple. There was anger, significant anger, at Voss specifically, and at a system that had allowed it to continue for 18 months before anyone official moved on it. There were 3 families who resigned their membership entirely, citing loss of trust, and nobody argued with that choice. There were others who stayed and wanted accountability beyond the criminal proceeding, wanted structural changes, wanted to know how it had been allowed to happen. Castellano addressed each concern in writing and in person at a member meeting in December that ran 4 hours and included some of the sharpest conversation Rachel had ever sat through. She attended as a private citizen, not as cooperative staff. Her employment status was in transition, her role having become complicated by the fact that she was simultaneously the cooperative's most important witness and an employee of the institution under investigation. Castellano resolved this in January by offering Rachel a restructured position, not the same accountant role, but a newly created compliance and financial oversight function, with a reporting line directly to the board rather than to the director. A structure designed specifically so that what had happened with Voss's invoices could not happen again without someone independent seeing it. Rachel sat on the offer for a week. Then she took it. Ethan came to dinner on the second Saturday of December. He brought a bottle of wine he'd asked the woman at the small Pine Hollow grocery store to recommend because he had no strong opinions about wine, and she apparently did. He brought Ranger. He spent about 40 seconds on the porch before knocking, which he didn't do deliberately, but which was the amount of time it took him to reach a decision he'd already made and confirm it. Rachel opened the door before he knocked. "I heard Ranger on the steps," she said. The house on Maple Creek Road was a 2-bedroom craftsman that looked smaller from the outside than it was inside. It had the particular organized quality of a home run by someone with good systems. Not sterile, not staged, just arranged with the logic of a person who thought carefully about where things went and why. The kitchen was warm and smelled like something that had been cooking for a while, and the table was set for 3 with the good plates that Ethan could tell were not the everyday ones because they had the slightly careful placement of dishes used on specific occasions. He thought about not saying anything about that, and then said, "You use the good plates." "I use the good plates when I want dinner to feel like an event," Rachel said. "Is that a problem?" "No." "Good." Ava came from the hallway in her wheelchair with a focused velocity that suggested she'd been waiting and was done waiting. She was wearing a yellow sweater and her hair was down, and she looked like someone who had slept 8 hours a night for 2 weeks straight and had returned to a version of herself that the events of November had temporarily displaced. She looked at Ethan for a moment. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "People say things." "I know." He held her gaze. "I came." She looked at Ranger, who had already crossed the room to her with the directness of an animal
who has identified a person as someone he intends to maintain contact with and is not interested in the social negotiation humans use to arrive at the same conclusion. She put her hand on his head. He leaned in. "Hi," she told the dog. His tail moved. Dinner was chicken and roasted vegetables and rice, and it was very good in the specific way that food cooked by someone who knows what they're doing is good. Not complicated, just correct. Rachel had cooked it, and Ava had apparently supervised, which Rachel explained with the particular dry precision of a woman describing a long-established dynamic. She has opinions about seasoning. They're correct opinions, Ava said. They're confident opinions. Same thing. Ethan ate and listened to them and said things when things occurred to him to say, and the conversation moved the way conversations move between people who are still in the early stages of figuring out their specific register with each other. Careful in places, loose in others, with occasional moments of genuine unexpected ease that neither side seemed to want to comment on directly. In case commenting on it made it self-conscious. Ranger spent the dinner under the table. Ava fed him 2 pieces of chicken, which Ethan saw and chose not to address. After dinner,
Rachel made coffee, and they sat in the front room, and at some point Ava said, "Can I ask you something about the Navy?" Ethan looked at her. "Sure. When you were doing it, did you ever think about stopping, like before you actually stopped?" He thought about the honest answer. "Yeah." "What kept you going?" "Different things at different times." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Early on, it was proving something. To myself, mostly. Later, it was the people I was with. Toward the end," he paused, "I'm not sure I was fully honest with myself about whether I should stop. The knee made the decision easier." "You didn't choose to stop." "Not entirely." "Do you regret it? Not stopping sooner?" Rachel was watching her daughter with the expression of a parent witnessing a conversation she'd expected eventually, but not necessarily at the kitchen table on a Saturday in December. "Some days," Ethan said. "Not the way you'd think, maybe. I don't regret the work. I regret the version of myself that thought the work was the only thing." He paused. "That sounds like a line." "It's not. It's just hard to say without sounding like a line." Ava looked at him directly. "It doesn't sound like a line." "How do you know?" "Because you looked uncomfortable saying it." He looked at her for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She seemed satisfied with that, in the way she seemed satisfied with things that told her something true, even if the true thing was not uncomplicated. Rachel was looking at the coffee cup in her hands. "I thought about leaving," she said. It wasn't addressed to anyone specifically. It landed in the space between all 3 of them. "After I found the first discrepancy, before I called Hargrove, I thought, there are other accounting jobs. There are cooperatives in 2 other counties. There are private firms in Eugene. I could just update my resume and disappear from this situation entirely." "Why didn't you?" Ava asked. "Because I knew the names on those accounts." She looked up. "I knew which families were being shorted. I'd met some of them. There's a family named Delacroix, 3rd-generation farm on Route 6. They grow hazelnuts and row crops. The parents are about 60, and they have a grandson who's supposed to take it over in 5 years. She paused. "They were being billed $400 a quarter in fraudulent delivery fees. That's not the number that sounds dramatic. But across 6 years, on a farm that size, on margins like theirs, it accumulates into the difference between making the equipment loan payment and not making it." She set the cup down. "I couldn't leave knowing that and just let it keep happening." The room was quiet. Ranger had moved from under the table to the rug in front of the couch. He was watching the 3 of them from there with his characteristic unhurried attention, as if following the conversation through the tonal changes in voices rather than the words. "Delacroix," Ava said. "The cooperative reached out to them about restitution?" "Castellano's handling it. All 340 member accounts have been audited. The families who were most significantly impacted will receive restitution from the asset seizure once the legal process finalizes." Rachel looked at her daughter. "How do you know about the restitution program?" "I read the December member bulletin." "You're not a member." "Castellano posts them on the cooperative website. They're public." Ava paused. "I've been reading them." Rachel looked at her. "Why?" "Because it matters what happens." She said it simply. "You almost didn't come home because of this. I want to know what happens." Rachel looked at her daughter for a long moment with the specific expression of a mother who is watching her child become something more than the thing she's been safeguarding. Ethan looked at his coffee. The rattle in his truck's heater was going to need addressing. January brought the kind of Oregon winter that was less dramatic than it was relentless. Not the snow that television expected of winter, but the low gray persistence of cold and damp that settled in and made itself at home without apology. The river ran high. The mountains disappeared behind cloud for weeks at a time. The Douglas firs were so wet they darkened from green to nearly black, and the sword ferns on the ground looked lacquered. Ethan fixed the porch railing. He got the oil change. He got the wiper blade. He had a mechanic look at the truck heater, and it turned out to be a blend door actuator, which was a $60 part and 20 minutes of labor that he could have addressed in March and had not. He went to his physical therapy appointment, then the next one. His therapist, a laconic man named Brower, who communicated mostly through specific exercises and measured silences, noted in January that Ethan's consistency had improved and that the knee's range of motion was responding. He said this without celebration, which was appropriate. Ethan began walking the river trail again in the mornings, the same route as November, and sometimes he took the extension that went past the police station on Carver, and sometimes he didn't, and either way, Ranger walked beside him with the steady satisfaction of an old dog in familiar territory. The dinner on Maple Creek Road became a pattern without being declared one. The second time was late December, the third was the first Saturday in January, and by February it was simply a thing that happened on Saturday evenings when nothing intervened and nothing usually intervened. Rachel cooked more often than not. Ethan brought things, wine, bread from the bakery on 3rd Street that was better than it had any right to be for a town this size. Once a pie that he'd attempted himself and that was structurally compromised, but adequately edible. The crust has some issues, he said when he brought it. It's fine, Rachel said. It's not. I've had worse. She paused. I made worse last month. The one Ava described as architecturally challenging. That's generous of her. She's been studying vocabulary. The dinners were good. Not because they were effortless, they weren't entirely. There were conversations that found awkward corners and took a moment to navigate out of. There were silences that ran longer than comfortable before someone said something. Ethan was not naturally easy in domestic spaces, particularly other people's, and he was working on that without calling it working on it, which was a method he'd used for most of his adult life with mixed results. But they were good. Ranger helped. He always helped. He moved between the three of them with calm, democratic attention, accepting contact from whichever human was nearest, maintaining his position as the room's lowest stakes presence, the steady weight that made everything around him feel slightly more settled. Ava had started talking to him when she thought nobody was listening. Ethan heard it once from the front room while Rachel was in the kitchen. Ava in the hallway, her voice low and conversational, telling Ranger something about a school project involving the watershed system of the Willamette Valley, asking him what he thought about stormwater runoff regulations. Ranger made the low sound in his throat, the one Ethan associated with hot trails and important things. Ava said, "I knew you'd agree." The formal legal process churned forward at its own pace through the winter and into spring. Martin Voss's attorney, having filed and lost 2 more suppression motions by March, requested a meeting with the DA's office in April. The meeting produced a plea negotiation that took 3 weeks to finalize. The eventual agreement, 4 counts of fraud, 1 count of conspiracy, restitution of $340,000 to the cooperative's member fund, was not the full accounting that some of the farming families had wanted. The Delacroix family attended the sentencing hearing in May, and the father, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, who looked like someone who had been working outside his whole life and intended to keep doing it, sat in the second row and said nothing during the victim impact portion, and then walked out when it was over without looking at Voss. Rachel attended the hearing. Ava did not because she wasn't allowed, but because after thinking about it carefully, she decided she didn't need to see Martin Voss in a courtroom to understand that the thing was finished. She'd read the plea agreement summary that Rachel brought home. She'd read the restitution schedule. She understood the outcome. "Is it enough?" Ethan asked her a few days after the hearing. They were on the river trail, an extension of the Saturday evening pattern that had developed naturally, because after dinner the 3 of them sometimes walked and Ava pushed her own chair on the paved sections and accepted help on the uneven parts without making it complicated. Ava thought about the question for a moment. For the families? Probably not fully. You can give someone money back, but you can't give them back. The 11 years they didn't know it was happening, or the stress of the margins being tighter than they should have been. She paused. But he's not going to keep doing it, and the cooperative is different now. Castellanos implemented 3 new audit structures, and the board has 2 new members who actually read the financial reports before they sign them. She looked at the river, which was high and fast and opaque with snowmelt. I think enough is sometimes the best version of what you get. Rachel was walking beside them. She was quiet for a moment. That's a mature thing to say, she said. I've had to think about what enough means for a long time, Ava said. With a lot of things. Neither Rachel nor Ethan said anything to that. The river ran. The dog moved ahead of them on a loose lead, nose working the bank. April brought the other thing. The one that had been building since November in the small, accumulating way that significant things build. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the patient weight of something that is true taking up more and more of the available space until the available space is mostly it. It was a Tuesday. Ethan had driven Ava home from her after-school program, a thing that had started in February as a practical arrangement on 3 days when Rachel's new compliance schedule ran late, and had continued past the point of practical necessity into the territory of being simply what happened on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He'd gotten better at the wheelchair lift procedure. He'd been bad at it in the beginning, self-conscious, overcautious, which Ava had let go on for approximately 1 week before she gave him a flat, precise tutorial on how to help without making it weird. You're treating it like it might break, she told him. I don't want to... It's a chair. It's built for this. Just here. She demonstrated the angle she needed for the vehicle door and the specific grip point on the frame. Like that. Don't apologize when you do it. It makes it take longer. He'd stopped apologizing. The process became routine. Routine became comfortable. On this particular Tuesday, they were sitting in the truck in front of the house on Maple Creek Road, in the specific state of post-conversation that happens when a conversation has been good enough that neither party wants to end it, but the parking situation eventually requires it. They'd been talking about school. Ava had a teacher who'd asked the class to write a personal essay about someone they admired, and Ava was stuck, not because she didn't know who to write about, but because she knew and was uncertain whether to do it. Why uncertain? Ethan asked. Because the person I want to write about would probably be embarrassed. He looked at her. And because... She stopped and started again. Because what I want to say about why is complicated. It's not the obvious thing. It's not she found my mom, or he's brave, or anything that fits in an essay cleanly. What is it then? She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the April rain was light and intermittent, the kind that couldn't make up its mind. It's that you kept going when the obvious thing was to stop, she said. At every point. You could have called 911 from the sidewalk and left. You could have left after Demko took over. You could have driven home from the barn when they started treating it like a crime scene. Every point where a person could have reasonably said this is handled, I'm done. You didn't. She paused. And not because you were trying to be a hero. I think you actually just didn't want to. I think you thought if you left something might get missed. Ethan looked at the rain on the windshield. And I think, Ava continued carefully, that you've spent a long time believing that the thing you're best at is the thing you were trained to do, and that when you left that, you lost the context where you make sense, like a tool that doesn't know what it's for anymore. He was very still. I think Ranger knows what he's for, she said, because every time he's needed, he knows exactly how to show up. And I think you're like that too. You just didn't know it had a different shape out here. The rain moved through a gust, and the truck windows blurred. Ethan's hands were on the wheel, even though the truck was parked and had been parked for 15 minutes. He said, That's a lot to put in a 7th grade essay. I know, she said. I'm going to figure out what to cut. She got herself out of the truck with the efficient self-management she used for everything, and he helped with the chair without apologizing. And she said, See you Thursday, and wheeled up the ramp to the front door that had a proper ramp now. Installed in February when the town's Public Works Office had committed to a community-wide accessibility audit following a formal request submitted to the City Council by 12-year-old Ava Bennett with a 2-page supporting document. He'd read the supporting document. It was good. He sat in the truck for a few minutes after she went inside. Then he drove home. The accessibility audit completed in June, and the town approved funding for sidewalk improvements on 7 routes identified as primary paths between residential areas and public services. The Maple Creek Road corridor was on the list. So was the stretch near the highway crossing with no pedestrian signal, which was now scheduled to receive a dedicated push-button signal and a raised crossing platform by the following spring. Ava attended the city council meeting where the funding was approved. She sat in the front row in her wheelchair and took notes on her phone and did not speak during the public comment portion because she'd already spoken during the input phase 3 months earlier when it mattered, and she understood the difference between the moment that changes things and the moment that confirms them. Ethan drove her to the meeting. Rachel couldn't make it. The cooperative's first full external audit was presenting to the board that evening, and she needed to be there. On the drive back, Ava was quiet for a while. "The Delacroix family," she said. "What about them?" "I looked them up, the hazelnut farm on Route 6. She looked out the window. "They're still operating. The grandson who's supposed to take over. He's 23. He's been working there since high school." "Okay. I want to write them a letter," she said. "Not about the case or the restitution or any of the legal stuff. Just, I want to tell them my mom found it. I want them to know that someone was paying attention and that it's different now and that they should stay." She paused. "Is that strange?" Ethan thought about it. "No. It might be strange to receive." "Probably," he said. "Still worth sending." She wrote the letter. 3 drafts over 2 weeks, each tighter and more direct than the last. Rachel read the final one and didn't change anything. Ethan read it and said it was good, which was not something he said without meaning it. The response came 6 weeks later. A handwritten note from the grandmother. 3 sentences in a looping script on paper that smelled faintly like the outdoors. It said that they knew who Rachel Bennett was because Hargrove's office had told the families whose cases it mattered most. It said they were grateful. It said the grandson had decided to stay. Ava read it twice and then put it in the desk drawer where her mother kept important things. The summer moved the way summers do in the valley, long and dry and green after the wet spring, the mountains visible again, the river dropping to a clear and walkable shallowness that was nothing like its February self. Pine Hollow looked better in summer. Most places do. Ranger turned 9 in July. Ethan acknowledged this by buying him a specific brand of beef-based chew that he normally rationed because Ranger ate them fast, and then looked at Ethan with a focused hopefulness that was frankly a little manipulative for an animal that presented otherwise as stoic. On his birthday, he got 2 without the look, which Ethan described as a concession and Ranger treated as a baseline. They were on the river trail one August morning, the 3 of them. Rachel had started joining on Saturdays, which had been her suggestion, offered in the same careful casual register as the original dinner invitation, with room left for him to treat it as nothing. He hadn't. Ranger was 20 feet ahead, nose working the bank. Rachel said, "Hargrove called yesterday." "About?" "The restitution processing. First payments go out next month to the member accounts." She paused. "He also said the plea agreement has held. Voss won't be reconsidering." "How'd that feel to hear?" She thought about it. "Smaller than I expected. I thought it would feel like something landing. It felt more like—" She paused. "Like a door closing. Not dramatic, just done." He nodded. "I've been thinking about what Ava said," Rachel said, "in December, about how we were both scared and not telling each other." "And?" "We've been talking more, since then." She kept her eyes on the trail. "About things we used to root around, her chair, what it costs her that she doesn't say it costs her, my work, what I was carrying that I didn't want to make her carry." She paused. It's not a solved thing. We still go around sometimes, old habits." She glanced at him sideways. "You're better at the direct version. I learned it the hard way." "What does that mean?" "It means I spent a long time thinking that not saying difficult things was the same as managing them. It's not." He looked at the river. "They just accumulate." "Where'd you figure that out?" "Physical therapy, actually." He paused. "Brower doesn't do indirect. He'll ask you a question and just wait. However long it takes. First time he did it, I sat there for about a minute before I realized he wasn't going to let me off the hook." Rachel almost smiled. "I like Brower." You've never met Brower. I like the concept of Brower. Ahead of them, Ranger had stopped and was standing very still at the edge of the bank, looking at something in the water. Not a duck. He was past the age of meaningless interest in ducks. Something that had caught his attention in the specific way that things worth attention caught it. Ethan called him back softly, and he came, tail moving. Ava had come up alongside Rachel on the wide section of trail where the paving was good, and the grade flat enough that she moved without effort. She'd been quiet for a while, which with Ava meant she was thinking about something and would say it when it was ready. I finished the essay, she said. The admiration one? Rachel asked. Yes. Who'd you end up writing about? Ava looked at Ethan. He looked back. Both of you, she said. I split it. Mom for the 6 weeks before November, you for November, and Ranger. She paused. My teacher tried to tell me the prompt said one person, but I explained that the situation didn't accommodate that constraint, and she accepted it. Rachel said, You explained it. I made a reasonable case. Of course you did. Ethan looked at the river. The mountains were fully visible today, the upper ridgeline still carrying the last of the snowpack in bright patches against the dark timber. The kind of view that made the valley look like it belonged to a different and larger story than the one being lived in it daily. What did you say? He asked. About November. Ava was quiet for a moment, the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much to give. I said that the most important thing you did wasn't finding her. It was that you didn't decide before you knew enough to decide that the situation wasn't yours to care about. She paused. That's the thing most people do. They make a decision about relevance before they know enough to make it, and then they go. He didn't say anything. You stayed because Ranger stayed, she said. I know that. You've said it. She looked at him steadily. But you've been paying attention to Ranger for 8 years. That's not accident. That's a person who's decided that what a good dog finds worth stopping for is worth stopping for. She paused. That's a kind of faith in something, even if it's a dog. The word faith from a 12-year-old on a river trail in August with the mountains visible and the water running clear and the dog walking beside her wheelchair with his ears up and his tail easy. He thought about 14 years and the plate in his knee and the empty house and the deferred maintenance and the policy about not getting involved that had turned out to be less of a policy than he'd thought. He thought about a wheel spinning in the rain outside a police station at 7:15 on a November morning. Yeah, he said. Okay. Ranger moved ahead on the trail. Rachel walked beside Ethan. Ava kept pace alongside, her hands easy on the rims, and the four of them moved along the river in the August light, each of them carrying the weight of the winter that had made them what they were to each other now. Not light, exactly, but bearable, the kind of weight that distributes across more than one set of shoulders. The mountains were visible all the way to the ridge. The river ran clear. The dog walked on. 6 months later, at the Youth Accessibility Committee's first formal presentation to the Pine Hollow City Council, a Tuesday evening in February, the room half full of residents and half full of the particular awkward energy of civic process. A 12-year-old girl in a wheelchair read a 2-minute statement without notes, without hesitation, without apology for the space she occupied or the chair she occupied it in. She said that accessibility was not a favor extended to people who needed it. She said it was a design problem, and design problems have solutions, and solutions require someone to notice the problem first. She said she noticed it because she had to live it, and that she was going to keep noticing it, and that she hoped the council would keep listening, because listening was the thing that made the difference between a problem acknowledged and a problem solved. The council voted 4-1 to fund the second phase of the improvement schedule. In the back row, Rachel Bennett sat beside Ethan Calloway, and Ranger was under the seat in the specific compressed patience of a working dog who understood that some environments required stillness and was content with that. When Ava finished and the council chair thanked her and the room began the shuffle of dispersal, Rachel looked at Ethan. You should have seen her face in November, she said, when she was on the floor outside the station. I did see it. She wasn't scared. I mean, she was underneath, but mostly she was decided, Ethan said. Rachel nodded. Decided. He thought about that. A 12-year-old girl in the rain, a notebook pressed to her ribs, a wheel spinning in a gutter while the morning went on around her without stopping. Decided. That was the word. That was what he'd seen on the pavement and recognized without naming it, The thing that had made him stay when the obvious thing was to go. Not courage exactly, though it was that too. Something more specific. The refusal to accept that the world's indifference to your situation constituted a verdict on your situation's importance. The decision, made in the cold and the wet and the alone, that the story was not over just because no one was watching it. He'd been watching it for 8 months now. So had Ranger. It turned out that was enough to change the shape of a life. Maybe more than one. Across the room, Ava was talking to a woman from the public works office, her hands moving the way they moved when she was making a case for something, clear and direct, and entirely without the diffidence that the world had spent 12 years suggesting she was supposed to have. She looked up once, found him across the room, and gave him the look, the particular focused one that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not, the one that was hers specifically. He gave it back as best he could. Ranger's tail thumped once on the floor under the chair. That was enough. Oh, real strength isn't always the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes it's the quiet, stubborn refusal to stop moving when the world has decided you don't matter. And sometimes, all it takes for that strength to change everything is one person willing to stop and listen.